Hey everyone, today we're stepping into the shadows of history's deadliest witch hunts, Salem and Torsaker. Two different trials. They're approximately 17 years apart, two tragedies, and just one question: how far can hysteria and how far can society be pushed before reason is lost forever? So follow me today as I take on these two cases that happened years apart, but very similar in style and the fact that many lives were lost because of society and how superstition can play a part of this. Thank you for joining me for Crime and Chaos Diaries. The month of October, one of my favorite months, and I'm just taking a little walk here in the woods to cover this. I thought it was a perfect background for this case in this month, October, and let's get started. The first I'm covering today is the Salem witch trials, and this was between the Putnams and the Porters. Now, the Putnams were wealthy, land-hungry farmers. They lived on the western side of Salem Village, deep in Puritan roots. And then you had the Porters. They were pretty much merchant-minded. They were into pork trade. They were less rigid than the Putnams were. Putnams supported Reverend Samuel Parris. He was the minister, and he was the one that started most of the hysteria to happen in Salem. Porters opposed Parris. They did not like his preaching. They did not like his financial demands. And they wanted something less rigid, more in line with Salem's moderation that was happening. Like, they wanted a more modern stance, and he was not the one that they felt could bring that to them. At Reverend Parrish's house, he had his daughter Betty, she was 9 years old, and then Abigail Williams, she was the niece, and she was 11 years old. Now, they began to spend more time together. They played, and they had the Parrises had a slave that they owned, and I'm probably going to slaughter her name. I've tried to look this up. Titubia is her name. And Titubia, she would tell them folk stories. And she would also, she believed she would do she would do some superstitions and fortune-telling games to entertain the girls. One of the games that intrigued the girls so much was called Venus Glass or Venus Egg. And it was a type of ritual that Tiberius taught the girls. And what would happen with that is they would take a glass and you would crack an egg in the glass. And if the glass, there were certain shapes that would form, and folklore superstitions behind the shapes. And one of them that she taught them was a shape of a coffin, of course, meant death. So the girls also began hanging around some of the other village girls that joined in with them. And before long, after these girls all got together, all of a sudden these girls, they started having fits, like shaking all over, yelling out, saying that they were being taken over. And so, of course, panic began amongst the village. And that is when they began to pressure the girls to tell them, for them to tell everyone who is doing this to you. Of course, witches was very popular, like it was amongst everybody that it was going rampant, is what they believed. And so they pressured the girls to tell them, who's doing this to you? Who's bewitching you? So that's when the girls began accusing townspeople. Some of the townspeople that they accused, a lot of them were well-known, church-going people. For instance, Martha Curry. She was accused after doubting the girls, and her attempt to field even more suspicion then, just because she tried to actually tell everyone, you know, that she was defending herself. Ooh. Okay, here I'm going down here, if I don't fall. So after that was Rebecca Nurse. She was a devout old lady who lived in Salem and loved Salem. She was part of the Nurse family, which was rivals with the Putnams. So that's where a lot of people think, because she was part of the Putnams and the Porters were against each other, that's where some of they chose her as one of the people that they were saying was a witch as well. And she was hanged. She was one of the ones that was hanged. Rebecca Nurse is a sweet old lady. Then we had Elizabeth Proctor. So John, her husband, was very outspoken about the whole thing, and it just seemed that, well, they had an outspoken maid, and John, her husband, was also like intertwined in this and outspoken a little bit and didn't believe it. So it ended up that they just got into the situation themselves, and both were, the wife definitely was brought into it. So in summer of 1692, the court began to hear the cases. And of course, it was more like evidence that the spectators were given. That's basically what they based all this on. And the vision of the accused appearing in spirit form and tormenting the victims is basically what they went by. That the victims were saying that's what these witches were doing to them. So what was decided these would, from just that evidence, these ladies would, and people would be executed, and they were going to take them to Gallows Hills execution. And that was on June the 10th, 1692. Bridget Bishop was the first executed, and she was known basically because she owned a tavern and she dressed colorful most of the time. So then there was Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, there was Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds. They were all hung. July 19th, 1692, they were hung. And then on August the 19th, John Porter, George Burroughs, Martha Currier, and George Jacobs Jr., and John Willard. George recited the Lord's Prayer as he was being taken to be hung. It was believed that the witches were unable to recite the Lord's Prayer because they were evil, but he still did this, and they still hung him. Then on September the 22nd, 1692, Martha Corey, Giles Corey, Mary Easter, Alice Parker, Ann Pedetter, and Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardall all hung. 19 people were hung. 1 was pressed to death, and 5 dead in prison. Giles Corey was pressed to death with stones for not pleading guilty. So they took him up to a hill, and they laid him in, it was like a hole top. Laid him down, put a board on him, and then started putting really heavy stones. And they were trying to get him to confess to being a witch, which he refused to. He stuck to his guns. The law was pretty much, if you did not confess to being a witch, then your land would still go to your family. So he wanted that. He would not confess. And one of his last words, he said, more weight. Bless your heart. God, I don't even know how he did that, but bless his heart for staying with it, guys. Bless your heart. What I'm looking at next was Torsaker, Sweden. This was in 1675, so it happened even before Salem. And it was one that interested me just due to how many people died with this. It was a total of 71 people who died in like one day. And this just became, of course, again, in that time, there was just so much of witches going around. Everyone believed they were around, and it just hysteria. One thing of someone saying something, somebody mentioning anything about a witch, and hysteria began, and everyone, they basically would say, if that person can be a witch, anybody can be a witch. So with the witch panic in the Torsaker area began in the middle of this, if I can say his name is Laurentus Horanus. He was known as the witch priest. And children were used to accuse the adults again. It was always the children, and they were often by the priest of the church. They were threatened, as in, like, it was said that Horanus, what he would do, he would threaten the children. That he was going to put them in the stove and cook them. Pretty much, he'd like turn it on, going to burn them. So they were scared of that. I mean, he would use boiling water threats. He would just all methods. So what he had some of the kids do, there were some boys that were chosen, and as everyone was coming into church, they were told to point out the people that were witches. So some of the boys began to point out people, and one of them was a very influential woman of the church, and one of the boys accused her, pointed at her, and she just downright slapped him real hard. And then he apologized and said, I think the sun was in my way, I mistaken it. So he backtracked, and it did save her, surprisingly. A lot of times the accused were taken from their homes, and they were put, if they felt like they were witches, they were put on boards or in baskets so the witches could not touch the ground, because it was believed that if the witches touched the ground, they could cast spells on you. So they would keep them in these baskets or boards as they carried them to wherever to be held for trial. Priests that would do some of the investigating and asking questions to the witches, it was all kind of tactics that was used. A lot of times, of course, the priests would carry Bibles to protect themselves, or crosses. It was said that a lot of the accused, the women were shaved, like their heads, their bodies, to make sure they could not hide any kind of witchcraft items to cast spells, to do any kind of witchery on them. Accused were also stripped down to look for marks that were known for witches. So basically, if you had any kind of birthmark or any kind of marks on your body, you were a witch. So one of the main reasons, that they were accused for what they were doing, the witches at that time, was that they were taking children, and they would take them. They abduct children, and they would take them to Satan's Sabbath, which was the legendary meadow of Swedish folklore where the devil held his earthly court during a witch's Sabbath. So I didn't know much about that part. I did look into that, and that's all with like moons, and I don't know a lot about that and explain, but that's pretty interesting if you can look into that more. Over 100 people were accused, and they would be placed in different locations in the village, and they weren't really guarded during, like, when they were taken to different places, but they were refused food. and the only way they could eat is if their family brought them food. In 1675, after a sermon in Torsaker, that's when it was decided that 71 of the accused were led to the place of execution, and it was known as the Mountain of the Stake. And what happens when you would get there is they would then be stripped of all their clothes. Their heads would be chopped off. They would be put on a stake and burned. And just basically left there till they burned completely. The thing that's so frustrating about all this is that the higher courts were the ones that were supposed to be able to oversee these prosecutions, but at Torsaker that did not happen. They just took it among themselves to kill these so-called witches and to go ahead and execute them. That was their decision, but it was supposed to be a higher court, so it was really murder. All in all, with both of these stories, it is mainly just about hysteria, revenge for like Salem against two different families, and just taking the law into your hands and deciding the fate of people, which, like I said, was basically murder. So how do you feel about the Salem witch trials and Torsaker? They're very interesting and can go a little bit more deeper. There's several books, of course, some movies over the years, but tell me how you feel about these cases, and if you'll stay tuned for my Crime and Chaos Diaries, I do have more Halloween-ish stuff that I'll be doing this month, all month, and I love this time of the year and fall and Halloween, so stay tuned, and please hit like and subscribe to my Crime and Chaos Diaries. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a good rest of the night. Thank you.